following announcement has been paid for by the Wrestling Epicenter.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, guys.
Hello, ladies. Remember me? Let me talk to you, dummies.
It's now time
It's beer time. TikTok.
It's showtime!
for the longest running wrestling talk show in history.
We are huge. It's gonna be cool.
You're where it's at.
You smell like me.
Tune in each and every week.
You better keep listening, or I'll come out of your computer
And turn it on for you.
or else I'm gonna kick your stinking teeth in.
We've been known by a few names.
The needs of the many far outweigh the needs of the few.
The Interactive Interview,
Interactive interview. Oh, yeah.
Interactive interview.
The interactive interview. Interactive interview. The interactive interview.
Interactive Wrestling Radio,
Interactive wrestling radio.
Interactive Wrestling Radio.
Interactive radio.
Interactive wrestling radio.
Interactive wrestling radio.
The Blaze,
Blaze 1260 AM. The Blaze.
The Blaze.
Blaze. The Blaze Rock.
and a lot of other names.
Weekend Weird of Wrestling. The Pile Driver. The Epa Wrestling Center.
3 Count Wrestling.
The Hours Lab.
But it's all one show, the Wrestling Epicenter.
Wrestling Epicenter. The Wrestling Epicenter.
The Epicenter.
Wrestling Epicenter, dude. The Wrestling Epicenter. Don't get off.
And your host from day one,
By ignorance or arrogance.
James Walsh.
Wake up, sleepyheads.
Dr. Carol House.
It all starts
What a rush. Oh, Boomer Sooner.
Thank you very much.
I got 2 words for you. Thumbs down. Breaking necks and cashing checks. Burn. I've heard a lot about you guys.
Check it out. Get out of my face. You win!
But I'm desperately out of time!
So what you gonna do when Blaze-a-mania runs wild on you?
now.
Welcome back to Interactive Wrestling Radio. During our intro, I say that we are the longest running wrestling talk show in history, but I think this gentleman would probably take exception to that. One of the guys who did this before we did, and there's not a whole lot of them that did. Of course, I'm talking about the man who just wrote a great new book. His name is John Arezzi. Mr. Arezzi, are you with me?
I am here. It's good to talk to you.
It's such a pleasure to have you on, and I mentioned the book. It's out now, Matt Memories. It's a great read. It's a cool thing because I grew up in the New York area too, so obviously there's a lot of things, including the New York Mets, that get talked about in there. I guess let's start with the simple question. How has the reaction been thus far to the new book?
Well, as of today, it's the #1 new wrestling title on Amazon.com, so it's been doing quite well. I mean, ever since the book went up for pre-sale, literally in October, to the release on April the 6th, it's been consistently at the top of the charts at Amazon. So I'm really thrilled about that, as the publisher is. So it's been well received. There hasn't been many negative comments at all about it. I think the reviews have been great. The response from the communities, from wrestling to country music, have been phenomenal. So I think at this point, it's exceeded any expectations that we had for it.
That's beautiful. And your co-author is Greg Oliver. Obviously, he's got a lot of chops. How did Greg get to be part of it, and how is he to work with?
Greg is I call him my psychologist. I mean, when he signed on, there wouldn't be a Matt Memories project if it wasn't for Greg. At ECW Press, when I reached out to them, and Michael Holmes, the executive editor there, had interest right away because he knew who I was and didn't know my whole story. But he said that you're a first-time author, and we really need to hook you up with somebody that can work with you on the project. And if you can get one of these people that I recommend, then I think we'll have a deal. And one of those guys was Greg Oliver. And I met Greg at the Cauliflower Alley Club reunion, the first one I'd ever attended in 2019. Introduced myself, and he was kind of like, well, you know, I've done so many wrestling books. But then when he heard about my story, about the changing of the names when I went into country music and working for the Mets and growing up in Bushwick section of Brooklyn and moving to Long Island and the whole history, he found it compelling. And when he signed on to do it, the deal happened pretty quick.
That's beautiful. That's awesome. And the book is a great read. I'll be honest with you, probably more honest than other interviewers. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I've skimmed through the parts that I was definitely interested in, and I intend on going back. But I only got it in the mail like 2 days ago, so I only had a couple of days to kind of crash course it.
Yeah, you'll find it a good read. I mean, it's an easy read. It flows pretty nicely, but there are a lot of twists and turns and hitting bottom, rising up from the ashes. There's drama. There's love lost. There's the wrestling business. It's an interesting roller coaster.
Absolutely. And like I mentioned to you off the air, before we started, I was listening to recent interviews you had done and watching old TV clips. And one of the interviews that you did was with Jim Cornette. I'm sure that's probably been the most widely reported on one. But one of the topics you discussed in that I wanted to talk to you about was wrestling in Madison Square Garden. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up just across the river in New Jersey. But I did a lot of press for Ring of Honor when they were going to run the G1 Supercard in Madison Square Garden. And talking to a lot of those younger guys, it was like being baptized in the Vatican. They were absolutely amazed by the concept that they would be able to wrestle in those hallowed halls. I guess way back in 76, back in the day, was it an honor to work Madison Square Garden?
Well, I never wrestled at the Garden, but I certainly I saw every wrestling show there from August 30th of 1971 right through 1977.
Uh-huh.
I was a ringside photographer, and Madison Square Garden is magic. It's the Mecca, and back then when you had the opportunity to see Andre the Giant's first match in New York, and you got to see Bruno Sammartino perform multiple times, and Pedro Morales and Freddie Blassie, and so many others. I mean, it was the place to be, and I was really young. I was when I got my press credentials, I was around 16 years old, and I was sitting alongside George Napolitano and Bill Apter and all the other ringside photographers who were in the scene at that time. And it was just amazing to me to even have that opportunity to be at ringside and shoot all of the major stars at the Garden for that period of time. And right now, I mean, in my archives, I have over 10,000 photographs from Madison Square Garden, and
Incredible.
even predating my ringside photography gig. I was just a kid, and I'd be taking my 8mm camera to the Garden, sitting at ringside and filming matches on 8mm. So I have Andre's first match at the Garden. I have Mil Mascaras' first match. I have the first women's match at the Garden. I have all those matches Pedro did. I mean, I shot film for about a year and a half there, and those are, to me, priceless today.
Absolutely, I would say that they are, and I've seen that you've been posting some of those on social media, some of those clips.
Yeah, I share those clips because I really think there's something there, and I am hoping to eventually get the opportunity to distribute these classic films, whether it's by myself or whether it's through a partner. I think that history needs to be kept alive, and I think that what I have, no one has, because the WWF at the time didn't even tape the matches at the Garden, really, until around 76, 77, and the stuff that I filmed predates that.
That could be your version of the legendary Jim Cornette garbage tapes, if you will.
There you go. There you go.
All right, so... Your partner is Brian Last on your podcast, and we'll talk a little bit about that as time goes by here. But he's a big Mets fan, I know that, and I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about the baseball side before we delve entirely into the wrestling side of things. Basically, I would like to know, when were you part of the New York Mets organization, and what was your role there?
My role with the Mets, first I was just a fan. I mean, 1966 was my first game, and I fell in love with the team, and they've broken my heart hundreds of times over the course of history. But my desire when I was in college, I mean, that's what I wanted to do. I had a passion, and I wanted to work for the Mets. So a friend of mine I went to college with had gone to the baseball winter meetings in 1979 and got himself a job with, I believe it was the Seattle franchise in the minors. And he suggested that I go to the baseball winter meetings in 1980 because each and every year they have a job fair there for people wanting to break into the game. So I went to the baseball winter meetings in Dallas, Texas in December of 1980, and I saw a posting for a opening for the Mets single A team in Shelby, North Carolina, which was the South Atlantic League. And I sought out the person who owned the franchise and finally got to sit down and chat with him, and he hired me on the spot. And I moved to North Carolina in early 81 to work for the Mets in a capacity that literally you did everything from sponsor sales, advertising sales. I was announcing the games, and I had some really cool roommates. John Gibbons, who was the Mets' #1 catching prospect back then. He was a roommate of mine, and he went on to do great things, as you know, with the Toronto Blue Jays as manager, and he wrote one of the forwards in the book. And J.P. Ricciardi was my other roommate, who became a top-level baseball executive with Toronto as the general manager, and he's still in the game. And we had another kid from New Jersey named Mike Hennessy, who really didn't go far, but he was an interesting guy. But on that team was Lenny Dykstra, who I got to know. It was his first stop on his way up to the majors. He was a very eccentric kid back then, still today. He was a bit of a nut, a bit of a kook. Roger McDowell was on the team. Yeah, we had a good team. But I did everything that you could be asked to do. And my cup of coffee, as I call it with baseball, ended, literally after a season when I went into a nightclub and I met a singer named Patty Loveless, and I quit my job with the Mets to manage her. And she has become one of the most iconic figures ever in country music. But that was my cup of coffee with the Mets. And with everything I did in my life, I mean, baseball still, to me, is the thing I'm most passionate about. And I wish I would have stayed in baseball. The working title to the book, I mean, I wanted to call the book "I Should Have Stayed in Baseball," but they wanted to market it to the wrestling community and the wrestling consumer.
Yeah.
So that name fell. But I mean, when I say my cup of coffee with the Mets is still the best tasting coffee I ever had.
Very cool. I was actually asking because I wanted to hear if you had much to do with the best team in my childhood. I was a kid in kindergarten in '86 when the Rockstar Mets, the Mets with the wildest reputation, won the World Series, and that was amazing for me. So that's good. And you mentioned a couple of guys that were part of that team. So there you go.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough because John Gibbons, obviously he got injured early on, and then they traded for Gary Carter, and that was the end of John being anywhere to be a starting catcher for the Mets. But he was on that team in '86, and Dykstra was on that team in '86. Yep. So I was able to hang out with those guys back then and have, in a very small way, just to kind of be a little bit of an insider on the '86 Mets. I went to all the World Series games, and Gibbons got me the autographed balls. And, I mean, it was just a magical time, man. And Game 6 with Mookie.
Yep, that's what I actually named my cat Mookie. That's how much that's how much that hit meant to me when I was a kid. Absolutely.
Great team, and now hopefully it'll be a great franchise again with the new ownership that's taken place.
There you go. All right. So I will talk to you a little bit about your country music, but it's not my expertise. I'm more into the heavier rock and roll kind of stuff. But I did want to talk to you about what we both do, or at least did. I guess you still do it because you do the podcast now, looking back. And that is doing a wrestling talk show. And when I started, there was a lot of uncertainty about how to approach it. I started doing it in 2002, certainly a lot later than you did. But when I started doing it, there was still a level of kayfabe. I remember in particular, Abdullah the Butcher was going to do an interview with me, but he said, what if I write the answers down and my manager says it and I just stand in the background making noises? And I thought, I think that sounds like it would be absolute insanity. But Was it a hard sell to do a wrestling talk show on a more, I don't know, shoot level at that time?
It was. I mean, I really started Pro Wrestling Spotlight at college. I had pitched the program director, who was a student, the idea of a talk show, and I started Pro Wrestling Spotlight really in September of 1975. And it was strictly kayfabe. I had some connections. I was a ringside photographer. So that lasted, and that was always kayfabe. And then when I put it on commercial radio, this is years later in 1989, the business was changing. There were no shoot radio shows at the time, and I had no idea what the show would evolve into. It evolved into it organically. And it started literally when Ricky Steamboat left the WCW or NWA at the time with a contract dispute. And he came on my show to talk about those negotiations with Jim Herd. So that was really the first real shoot interview that I did. And then the following week, Jim Herd, who was running the show there, came on to answer what Ricky had said. And then the show started to evolve. And it was in... I believe March of 1990 when superstar Billy Graham came on the show for an hour to talk about what steroids did to him.
Yeah.
And the fact that 90% of, in his opinion, 90% plus of all wrestlers were on steroids. I mean, the show took a turn because then I got knee-deep involved with the Zaharian trial. And
Right.
the show just evolved into the shoot show. And it was really groundbreaking at the time. And it was not easy. No cooperation from WWF at all. WCW cooperated, but with a little bit of hesitancy because of the things I was covering. And then as the show evolved over the years, and it literally ran from 1989 into 1995, it became like the place that people would come on and shoot with the things that were going on in the business. Even when they left WWF, I'd get guys like Ultimate Warrior and Honky Tonk Man, and they would never talk to me, or they weren't allowed to talk to me while they were still employed by them. But I was the place to go after they had left to air their grievances and to really just kind of talk about the inside of the business.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It sounds very similar to a smaller degree for me. Because obviously I was never on, I was on AM radio, but not to the level you were by any stretch. But it sounds very similar to what I've been doing for many years. So I definitely understand where you're coming from. What do you think of the progression to where everybody now has a podcast? Everybody now has a chance to air their opinions. Certainly, I think it muddies the water. But what do you think of all of this new technology?
Well, I think that, obviously it's evolution. And everything has evolved to where everyone has an opinion. There are so many podcasts out there, but you gotta weed them out, and you gotta find what you're really interested in. Like for me personally, I love listening to Cornette, just because he's Jim Cornette, and he has no filter, and he says to me, and he's still a genius in my opinion. And I listen to, several of them. I listen to Conan. I listen to even to Vinny Rue occasionally. I listen to probably about half a dozen on a weekly basis. But there's too much out there right now. And, and it's a lot of it is speculation and innuendo and rumors. And, I mean, the wrestling business is filled with just inaccuracy when it comes to so many people just kind of reporting on rumors, which are really not fact. Exactly.
So before we started recording, I mentioned that I was watching an old episode of Donahue, and I was doing that to kind of re-brush up on the episode and all that scandal that went along with that. I guess, first of all, what was it like to be on daytime TV with Vince McMahon in your, arm's reach, and to be the expert that they were leaning on, yourself and Dave Meltzer and others, for the wrestling perspective on what they were talking about?
It was probably the most stressful time period that I was in pro wrestling because things were breaking almost daily. When the kids came out with the allegations of sexual abuse, and then some wrestlers came out and started talking about harassment. It wasn't an easy thing for me to cover because there was so much going on. I wasn't happy with myself on that Donahue show. I didn't like the way I looked. I didn't like the dark glasses. I didn't, I mean, it just wasn't something I was very proud of, even though it was a major historic moment in wrestling. And to have Vince McMahon sitting 2 seats from you and catching him in a lie, and he thought it was a setup. It was just very stressful. And to be honest with you, I mean, doing the radio show at that time was not easy either, because I had received a death threat, and you don't know who that came from. There were a lot of pieces involved, and it was just a scary time, and I wasn't happy. And you knew what you were reporting on could potentially bring the business down. And that was the thing I certainly didn't want to happen. All I wanted to do in my coverage was see if the business can get cleaned up somewhat, and to get the individuals out that were allegedly doing these things, and for the company to acknowledge what was going on and not condone what was going on. So it was not easy to cover, and to this day, I look back at that time period as like, wow. I mean, it was horrible to cover the business at that time.
I agree, and as a fan, I kind of let you in on my age. If I was a kindergartner in '86, then I must have been, maybe 10 or 11 when all this was on, and when they were on Donahue. And I remember sitting there, 4 o'clock on CBS, or I forget if it was NBC or whatever channel it was, watching it as a kid. And maybe I didn't fully get all the aspects of it just yet, of what you guys were talking about, but I could tell it was a serious, serious thing. And man, that was probably the most surreal thing, to have Vince McMahon in there, answering these guys to their face.
Yeah, and he certainly didn't want to be there. And I did an interview with Meltzer not too long ago, and we were talking about that show. And during every commercial break, Vince would be telling him, "This is the absolute worst day of my life." He didn't want to be there. And, the reason, from what I'm finding out even now, all these years later, was that, he had worked out an agreement, a settlement with Tom Cole, and he planted Tom Cole in the audience next to Linda McMahon and Miss Elizabeth. Oh. And I guess Vince was hoping that someone would bring the name Tom Cole up during that Donahue show, where he can then introduce Tom, and then Tom could dispute anything that was being said. But Tom Cole's name was never brought up, because we all found out that the settlement had taken place really minutes before the Donahue show aired.
Beautiful, beautiful. So Dark Side of the Ring, I've seen you appear on that, and there was a line in there on the Herb Abrams UWF version of Dark Side of the Ring, that episode, that I wanted to bring up. And that is that while you were doing the Q&A with him, talking about the promotion at your FanFest, he said that one of his biggest stars was going to be Bruiser Brody. And this was years after Brody had been murdered. As a guy who's, in front of a crowd and knowing what you know, how do you play that off? How do you react to somebody saying something that is just pretty insane?
Yeah, that comment got a lot of press, and I was promoting that convention. It was the actual first wrestling fans convention that we're accustomed to today. That was the first time, and Herb was there at that press conference to launch UWF, and I was not in the room when he said the Brody comment, but it was heavily reported that he did. And the thing I do remember was when he mentioned that Blackjack Mulligan was going to be his booker, and Blackjack Mulligan was in jail at the time. So, it was looked upon as a joke with her because of because of how eccentric he was, and, how over the top he was. And, but then when the UWF launched in late 90, early 91, I mean, he did sign a number of different, not sign, he never really had anybody exclusive as much as he said he did. There were a lot of big name stars there, but what really sealed it for me to try to help this guy was Bruno Sammartino's involvement as an announcer, and Captain Mil Albano, and people that I knew. And so I gave him a shot, but I had a short-lived relationship with him that really lasted until February '91. I helped him launch New York, and but he bounced a number of checks, and he was Herb, and Herb he was nuts, and so I mean the Herb Abrams era, which we're covering actually right now on Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now, because we go back 30 years and review these shows in chronological order. So it was an interesting time period, and Herb was one of the most peculiar individuals that I'd ever met, even in wrestling.
Absolutely, he was. And I did a lot of PR around the time that the Dark Side aired, talking to some of the old WWF guys. We got Craig DeGeorge, who was WWF, and all that. So we were talking a lot about it, and they all said the same thing. Sweet guy, but out of his mind.
But he had a lot of demons. He had a big drug problem, which everybody knew about, and he was a sweet guy, but he was also one of the most eccentric people I ever met. He was over the top. I mean, for a small in stature, but an ego that was huge. For a guy who wanted to compete with Vince McMahon and put Vince McMahon out of business, he had high hopes, and those came crashing down.
Very cool. So wrestling is no stranger to sex scandals. We already talked a little bit about the first one, but how did that compare to what you're seeing now with all the speaking out things that are going on now that basically crippled the UK wrestling scene to some extent, if the pandemic didn't do that already? What do you think of how that compares to where we were 30 years ago with the WWF sex scandal?
Well, I believe if what happened 30 years ago happened in today's society, it would be all over for the WWE, because of the fact that wrestling back in the day was never really considered anything people paid much attention to in mainstream media. But if those allegations surfaced in 2021 or 2020 or 2019, it would be all over. It would be massively covered, and it would have taken down a number of individuals, and it wouldn't have been a pretty scene.
Is that a sign of what the media is like, though? And I'm saying this, when the Chris Benoit thing broke, being a wrestling fan was not an easy thing to be, because you had Bill O'Reilly on there, and they're showing clips of an accident that happened between Sabu and Chris Benoit, 15 years prior, and they're saying that, oh, look, he was obviously a megalomaniacal maniac because he broke this guy's neck, and it's like, it was obviously a botched spot. Does these kind of things, drive you nuts as a wrestling journalist when non-wrestling people talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they don't have the knowledge. I mean, the Benoit situation, I mean, that broke my heart. I mean, I was so close to Nancy. She was one of my dearest friends, and to this day, it just hurts me. But the way the business has been covered traditionally by mainstream media, it really, they don't have their, they don't do their research. It's still in a lot of ways a joke to a lot of people. And they never really took it seriously. I mean, and even to this day, I mean, one of the things that I stand on my soapbox and talk about, not only on the podcast, but on a streaming show that I do, Pro Wrestling Spotlight Live on Facebook, is the fact that all of these guys are independent contractors, and all of these guys are not taken care of with health benefits or retirement plans, and they can't work for anyone else, even though they're considered independent contractors. I believe that because it's wrestling, people don't really care, and I think that if to this day, they're not treated fairly. Right. And that's why there's such a number of individuals that once they leave the business, they're broken, and they're broke financially. And it's sad to see what happens to the performers of pro wrestling, the vast majority of them, once they leave the business.
It seems like we're at a little bit of a different place, though, where you'll hear The Rock's name or John Cena's name mentioned, and there's not the snickering and laughter. And I had a little note here written down, and I skipped over it, but I'm going to go back to it. I know it's not your favorite topic, But during that Donahue episode, the audience would just spurt out into laughter for seemingly no reason whatsoever, and it seemed to be that they were just laughing at, ha ha, it's wrestling. And
Yep.
did that not, like, I mean, that still to this day made my skin crawl this morning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, even one of the things that I said, because, Vince Russo, ironically, had interviewed Lord Littlebrook, who was the guy who booked all the little performers,
Right.
the midgets, as they call back then.
Mm-hmm.
And when I mentioned the story about an allegation about what happened in a dressing room at Madison Square Garden, it was laughed off like it was some type of joke. And who knows if it happened, if it didn't happen, or whatever that case may be. But the midgets were not used after that allegation, and it was taken as a joke. I mean, a lot of it was, because these are big guys and they're being harassed sexually. Come on, give me a break. But who knows what happened really to a lot of these guys? But the way it was portrayed and the way the audience treated it. To this day, it makes my skin crawl as well, as far as the way people looked at it as a kind of a silly thing that was going on with these big guys.
All right. So I've heard you mention in other interviews the Arizona State Fair show, and I mention it because that's, maybe 10 minutes away from my house. I'm pretty close to that now. I live in Arizona. I wasn't at that show. I was still living in New Jersey at the time. But what was so significant about what went down at the Arizona State Fair show that you promoted that made you decide, I'm just done. That's it for me?
Well, I was, trying to keep my head above water, and you got to realize that all the radio shows that I did, they were paid programming. I had to pay to be on the air. So I wasn't making a lot of money, so I tried promoting, and then when you start dealing with performers who really, the majority of them back in the day, I mean, they just kind of chewed you up, spit you out, and didn't really care what would happen. And that particular show, I took a bath on it financially, but it was the fact that one of my heroes, Mil Mascaris, who came into the locker room and then upgraded his plane ticket to first class and wanted me to pay the difference. And one of the Samoans did the same thing. And I just had enough. I had enough of dealing with these people that were using you, and there was never really. I was becoming one of them. I was becoming somebody that working people, and I didn't like who I'd become. I was about to turn 40 years old. I had, as we were talking about wrestlers, I had no health benefits. I had no pension. I had no money. I was bankrupt for the most part. And I got sick of it. I got sick of dealing with the guys like Jake the Snake Roberts, who put me through hell, although I tremendously helped him back in the early 90s by setting him up with the AAA and just kind of working hard to work with the guy. I just couldn't handle it. I just had to get out. I had to get out of it, and that's when I got out. I changed my name, and I put it in the rear view. And ironically, a year later, after I left the wrestling business, I get a phone call, and it's Mil Mascaris. And he's like, "John, it's Mil Mascaris. What about the money for the plane ticket?" A year later. And wow. I just kind of cursed at him, and I said, I've been out of the effing wrestling business for a year, and you should have never, exchanged that plane ticket anyway. I never authorized it, so F you, and I hung up on it.
That's crazy. My next question was actually going to be about your timing. Your timing of leaving wrestling. I know you ended your radio show in early 1995, but it was 96 through 98 that the business really just heated up to a fever pitch, and they rode that wave, for 3, 4, 5 years of incredible popularity just based on how inventive wrestling got in those couple of years. Did you ever kind of kick yourself and think, I wish I had stayed in just a little longer, or was it was time?
I think it was time, but I did, I kept watching, and I kind of lamented a little bit that I might have got out a little early, but based on my relationship at the time with the WWF, I mean, I wasn't going to have any opportunity with them. ECW was flourishing, but that was a short-term thing, really, if you look at it. But wrestling took off, and it became hot again, and it became popular, and it saw and achieve success that really had never had done before. And partially, because of Vince Russo, a guy I brought into the business. So I was kind of like, I was interested in seeing what he was doing. I had friends like Mick Foley, who was really rising to prominence, and he was a dear friend, and I loved to see his success. And ironically, when I got out of wrestling and I went to work for a radio station on Long Island, a country station, with the new name John Alexander,
right.
I contacted WWF to see if they would advertise with me, and I developed a really good relationship with their advertising guy, and I started getting free tickets and going to all the shows, and I still was involved on a peripheral level, but no one knew who I was. And, certainly not the gentleman Hugo Maslick who I was dealing with at the time. So I watched. I continued to watch, and I really never stopped watching it because it's in my blood.
Beautiful, beautiful. You mentioned Vince Russo. Obviously, when you go on somebody like Jim Cornette's podcast, you can't be, Vince is such a great guy, because obviously there's a history there. What is your relationship and what is your opinion of Vince Russo and his, let's call them, contributions to the professional wrestling industry?
Well, Vince and I had a tumultuous short-term partnership when I brought him in first as an advertiser on Pro Wrestling Spotlight, ironically introduced to me by Jim Cornette's fan club president at the time, a 14-year-old kid named Andrew Goldberger. And then, that's the ironic thing. But, Vince was the guy that we had such an ugly breakup after only 3 or 4 months of partnership that I despised him. But ironically, again, he's one of the reasons I'm back in the wrestling business. And that happened basically because of a podcast that he did, and he started saying some disparaging things about me. And around Thanksgiving of 2018, and I decided that after all these years, I was going to try to confront him about these things. And we did a YouTube face-to-face, and we kind of talked like gentlemen. And since that time, we have I would say a friendship in a way. I mean, we've talked out our differences, and I do respect Vince, and I think he had enormous contributions to the Attitude Era, and he did some amazing things in it. I think that he was instrumental in becoming Vince's right-hand man, Vince McMahon's right-hand man back in the day. But he was an abrasive guy. He was always a very ambitious person, pushy in a lot of ways. But I think he had significant contributions to wrestling, but I also had significant contributions to the downfall of so many things. I'm thinking if I never met Vince Russo, would WCW still be in business,
It's funny, yeah. Space-time continuum and all that kind of stuff.
Oh.
There you go. So let's talk a little bit about your life, not as John Arezzi, as John Alexander. What made you decide to change the name? Is it just a fresh start, a fresh coat of paint on your life?
I wasn't happy with John Arezzi as a person. I mean, like I said, I had been through the mill, but I was also felt like I was becoming somebody that I didn't want to become. So when I got out of wrestling and I got hired by this little radio station, I was like, I'm going to just put John Arezzi in the rear view, and I don't want people to find me, and I just want out. So I was thinking of what can I call myself, and I was a big fan of Seinfeld and Jason Alexander, who was George Costanza.
Yep.
And I was a big fan of the show, and I said, well, Alexander's kind of generic, and I like that, and I like I like Jason Alexander, and I'm going to use a professional name and call myself John Alexander, and I changed my name and didn't look back, and of course legally I never changed it. It was always John Arezzi legally, but that was the turning point for me, and I reinvented myself. I was in the ashes. I was literally in the ashes, and the day I got hired by that radio station, I literally dropped to my knees and I said, please, God, if you can give me one opportunity, I will always do the right thing by people I do business with. I'll always underpromise, overdeliver, and I'll just change the way I live my life. And every year has gotten better since then. And so it really is a tale of a guy who just had hit rock bottom in wrestling and decided to change his whole direction. And for me, it was a godsend for me to do that and to leave wrestling when I did, because I achieved some pretty magnificent things after changing my name and working in the country music industry for as long as I had.
Very cool, very cool. And let's talk a little bit about, I know you talk about it a lot, but let's talk about Dixie Carter quickly. One thing I was curious about with the story you tell about when she and Jeff Jarrett came into your office, did Jeff Jarrett have any idea who you were? Had you met him previous to being John Alexander?
He was looking at me kind of funny, but he couldn't pinpoint where he knew me from, and I didn't lead on to anything except for, when I sat with Dixie and Jeff in my office that day. They were pitching me the TV show to put on GAC, Great American Country Television. Mm-hmm. They were fascinated by how much I knew about wrestling, how much I loved wrestling, but I never let on that I was somebody that used to be in the wrestling business and my name was John Arezzi. I just never let them know that. But it was a fascinating meeting, and that's when I met Dixie for the first time. And I've had interactions with Jeff since, and then we talked it all out. I mean, literally, when he was starting Global, 5-6 years ago, maybe longer. I don't even know.
I think it was 14, so like 7 years ago now.
Yeah, because he sat with me and he wanted me to work with him and do the marketing and we talked to Russo, we talked Dixie, we talked everything, and but I wasn't going to work for free, or I wasn't going to work on commission only. And with all these big aspirations that he had, I was certainly willing to dive in back then. But when someone doesn't offer you a payday, and he knew I was very well connected on the sponsorship front, and I opened some doors for him in Vegas and a few other places, but I did get to know Jeff, and he was trying to put something together, and it didn't happen. But, I wasn't going to go back down that road of being worked by anybody.
There you go. Exactly. A lot of con men in wrestling.
An abundance.
An abundance. That's true. Absolutely. So I guess we'll finish up by talking about your podcast and where they can get the book and all that good stuff. But I wanted to talk to you just one last question about the industry. And you're a guy who was around the Northeast when Bruno was the king. And I, God bless it, was given the opportunity to interview Bruno. I've done a lot of great things that I look back on and I'm just so honored to have done. You saw that era. You saw the rock and wrestling era. You saw the attitude era, even if it was in your periphery when you were doing advertising with country music. What do you think of where we're at now? What do you think of what wrestling is now? Because when I watch it, there's sometimes that I wonder why I'm doing that.
Well, you're not alone. I mean, when I look at today's presentation and today's product, it's certainly not what I grew up with and what I fell in love with when I was a kid, because I've been watching wrestling since 1964. I've seen it all. Today, it's evolution in a lot of ways. It's never going back to where it was. I think that today there are no larger-than-life performers like there were back in the day. I think the majority of these guys look the same. You can't identify one from the other, really. There are some standouts, but I think that we're never going back to the way it was. The fans, the guys like myself, the historians, and the fans in my demographic remember the old times, and I'm not enamored with what's going on today. The most exciting thing I saw in wrestling over the past several years was Ronda Rousey's appearance in the WWE, and I was watching every week because that drew me in. That was believable to me. There's no suspension of disbelief anymore, and that's the biggest part of it. There's no ruse. There's no, you can't attach yourself emotionally to any of the performers like you did years ago. So those days are long gone. They're never coming back. And no matter what Tony Khan does, and, he's certainly got the resources. And Vince McMahon, I mean, what he's done with the WWE, I mean, he's a genius, a smart guy. He's done $3 billion deals. And I think that there's still one more to go when he sells the company, whether it's to Disney or someone else. but it's purely entertainment. Everyone knows, that everyone knows what it is today. And there's nothing I can say other than, you long for the old days. But once again, at 64 years old, those old days aren't coming back.
Exactly. Well, I kind of share that same view with you. All right, so I've kept you longer than I said I would, so let's finish up with just a couple of things about what you're doing now. Let's talk about your podcast now with the great Brian Last, where you go over those classic episodes of your show. Did you want to talk about that and Brian Last?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brian was a listener of mine back in the day. I think he was 13 years old when I was on Pro Wrestling Spotlight, and he started listening towards the latter part of the run. But Brian is such a huge historian, and he's someone that wants to keep history alive. And several years ago, Brian and I communicated. I did a couple of his 605 podcasts to talk about a few different subjects, and was on the experience. And then when I started segueing back into wrestling as a historian, Brian and I had some conversations, and he asked me if I had all the radio shows, and I said, yeah, I have every single one of them. And he said, well, maybe we could do something together. And then we just kind of bantered around an idea, and it became Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now, where each and every week we go back in chronological order and we cover what was going on back in the day, kind of a listen along. We play highlights of those shows. He talks to me about about those moments that happened 30 years ago. And for me, it's like a time capsule, and it's jarring to my memory because I haven't heard these shows in 30 years. So each time we do a show, it's the first time I'm really experiencing what went on 30 years ago on that radio show. So it's a trigger to me about everything that happened back then. So the numbers are incredible because we gain new listeners every week, and then they start from the beginning. Even though we're in episode like number 80 right now, people. It's like episodic. It's like episodic television. It's like an old time capsule where each week leads into the week before, and the storylines and their characters from the very eccentric callers that have become iconic personalities, and we just have an incredible amount of fun with it. We laugh. We talk serious stuff about some of the biggest issues in the business. Right now we're going over the Iraqi war when McMahon turned Slaughter heel and became an Iraqi sympathizer. And then this year is really a pivotal year. If you go back 30 years to 1991, it was the year that Flair left WCW. It was the year of my biggest convention. It was the year of the scandals. It was the year I met Vince Russo. So this entire year, as it's unfolding, 1991, 30 years later in 2021, is fascinating for people to listen to. And we have a very loyal following. We have thousands of listeners every week from all around the world who are discovering the show for the first time. And those who lived it 30 years ago are still there. A lot of them are still there. All the old callers, I'm meeting them. They're buying my book, and we have a little Facebook group that people contribute to. And so, yes, it's the funnest thing that I've ever done in wrestling, to go back in this time capsule and do it. So Brian is an incredible host. We have a great chemistry together. So I love every single episode and every single minute working with him.
Awesome. And of course, the book is out now. And did you want to? I said this to Ric Flair once, and I managed to really piss him off. I asked if he wanted to plug his book one last time before we wrapped up, and I guess he was in a bad mood because he didn't like that question. But I'll ask you that question. Did you want to promote the book one more time?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. Right now, it's the number one wrestling book, new wrestling book in the country on the Amazon charts, and it's been consistently up there. So I have 3 of the top 10 titles in wrestling between the paperback, the actual book, the Kindle version, and the audio version, which comes out on May 11th. And I do have a special offer for anybody listening here, or anyone who would like a low-numbered signed copy of the book. All they got to do is send me an email, john@mattmemories.com, and I'll get a link out to you, and you'll get a signed numbered copy of the book. But if that's not your cup of tea, go to Amazon, go to Barnes & Noble, anywhere you buy books, Matt Memories is available, and it's selling really, really well. And I'm blown away by the numbers so far of what we're doing.
I appreciate you coming on the show, man. I told you this at the beginning, but I'll say it again. You're kind of a pioneer. You kind of paved the way for people like myself. Even though I was a little early to the show with doing a podcast before there were pods, definitely appreciate everything you did and contributed to the professional wrestling industry, and don't know that I would have had this opportunity if you didn't do what you did. So I really appreciate everything you did for wrestling.
And you're doing a fantastic job. And the names that you've interviewed, I mean, who's who of wrestling. So you keep up the good work as well. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today. And it was a pleasure for me to talk to you.
I appreciate it. All right, before I let you go, do you mind if I ask one last favor?
Go right ahead.
You probably know what I'm going to ask. Do you mind if I ask for a station ID?
Not a problem. Whatever you need, Ben.
All right. This is John Arezzi, and you're listening to the Wrestling Epicenter, or any spin thereof.
This is John Arezzi, and you're listening to the Wrestling Epicenter.
Beautiful, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I do apologize for keeping you on the phone for quite so long.
My pleasure. I mean, I blocked out an hour for this, and it was my pleasure to do this, and I really appreciate it. And I've really got to learn a little bit about you as I was doing some research. And you do incredible things, and I could just thank you again for allowing me to talk to you.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
The preceding announcement was paid for by the Wrestling Epicenter.
I'm a listen, and if you like what you heard, I'm glad. If you didn't like what you heard, well, go fuck yourself.
Most people don't hung up on me.
We had a lovely conversation.
What a show.
Oh, mercy, Daddy.
On your radio dial. Don't hang up. Bye-bye.